Hey everyone, in this video what we're going to do is set up the secret variable group inside of Terraform for the service principal that we're going to use to be able to use Terraform to authenticate back both to Azure and to Azure DevOps. So in our last video what we did is we authenticated Terraform so that it can connect to itself back into Terraform. So we have our prod and non-prod secret variable groups, and we have our TF variable that's then used to authenticate back into the Terraform provider. So we showed you how you can create an organizational token and how you can then put it inside of those variable groups and save it, and then now your Terraform and all of your various workspaces can now authenticate back into Terraform. So now there's two more that we need to set up, and the one that we're going to set up today is the secret variable for our service principal. So we are going to create a couple of service principals, one for prod and one for non-prod. Then we're going to create secrets for those, show you which of the permissions that are actually needed for those service principal, and then save that back into Terraform. So usually what we do is we only create one service principal that's able to manage both Azure and Azure DevOps. So there's components within Entra ID that the service principal is going to need access to. So we need to make sure that it has the right API permissions to make that possible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over into Terraform. So this is where we were in our last video, and what we showed by going into our settings. I'm moving my head around here. Moving into our settings, and we go into our variable sets, and you'll see that we have our DevOps prod secrets and our non-prod secrets. So if we go back into our prod secrets, you'll remember that we talked about environment-specific secrets. We talked about where we get this specific name from the provider documentation, and this is what we populated. Now what we need to do is populate the same concept is the ARM client secret. So again, very similar to before, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to search for our Terraform registry, and we're going to come out here to the Terraform registry, and we're going to show once again how we got these variable specific names. So if I browse into the providers and I go into Azure, I'm going to take a look at the documentation. And again, what's interesting about the Azure provider is there's a lot of different ways that we can authenticate into Azure. So there's so much that you can use using the Terraform provider. It's very, very powerful. To kind of make things easy, what we're going to do is use the service principal with a client secret. So there's just one client secret that we need to manage as part of the service principal, and we'll talk about service principals specifically as part of this video as well. So if we kind of come down here, this is very similar to before, where there's certain information that's going to be needed by the provider, and it kind of gives you the fields that it needs. But if we actually scroll down here, what it should tell us is how can we set this information specifically using environment variables. Because what we don't want to do is set anything outside or set things directly in code and use the secrets directly in code. We don't want to do that. So you'll see here that this is calling specifically the ARM client ID, and then wants the tenant, the subscription ID. We're going to get to all of those in the environment specific information. But again, these variable groups just have the secrets that are in them. So here's the ARM client secret. I can see this is here. And if we go down into the documentation and kind of walk through this, what you'll see is this is how exactly we authenticate to this provider. Actually, I think it's covered here in this one specifically. So it kind of talks about here is how we give it the various references. And then now we can say, here's the certificate. If we were doing certificate based off, here's our secret. But we can set ARM client secret as an environment variable, and that is where we get this name. So we need that client secret for a service principal. Now, if you're not familiar with service principals, they are wonderful. So back in the day, we would create a service account, which was technically just a user in Active Directory that had a username, had a password, and that was sort of this headless machine account that you would use to automate things. What's great about service principals is now using those, we can create service accounts or service principals for the application itself. We can grant just application permissions to this object. So now we're limiting the scope that this has access to by design. And now we can use other modern auth mechanisms so that we can just create bearer tokens and not be passing all this information in the header that has the password. And we can create different secrets, revoke those secrets for the specific service principal, which is also very, very nice. So while we could put a password for a user account in here, we would never do that. It's a lot easier and more safer and more secure to use a service principal. And what's great about Azure DevOps is it has full support for service principals. So you can use those and assign all the permissions within ADO to that service principal. And I'll show you how that's done. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to jump over into Azure. So this is our Azure portal. And I'm going to go into our Microsoft Entra ID. And from Entra, you're going to see there's two specific places that we want to talk about. There's enterprise applications and app registrations. So these two work in tandem with each other and sort of holistically are called a service principal. So that object, this enterprise application or service principal, is what we want to use to authenticate to Azure and to ADO. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an enterprise application. So you'll see the number of them that I have here. I'm going to go in here to create a new enterprise application. So again, Microsoft and Azure, they have all sorts of different templates that you can use to create these. And they have all sorts of out-of-box and various permissions that you can create directly from this gallery. We're just going to create our own application. So what I'm going to call this is I'm going to call it Terraform Azure DevOps. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to integrate this into our application ourselves. We're going to use non-gallery. Oh, it found an application that matches. Let's take a look at what that does. So now they have one specifically for Azure DevOps. An instance of this application for single sign-on, multi-tenant Entra ID. That's not actually what we want. So this is not what we're trying to do, is set up provisioning and single sign-on to add to Azure DevOps. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, nope, that's not the one we want, but thank you for asking. And we're going to say Terraform Azure DevOps, and we're going to create a non-gallery application. So this is a specific application just to what we're trying to do. It's because a lot of times enterprise apps, they can be used to configure a lot of the single sign-on configurations for applications. So that's what a lot of times the gallery is trying to help you with, but that is not actually what we want in this instance. Okay, so let me show you what has actually happened at this point. So now we've created an enterprise application called Terraform Azure DevOps. So there's two components. There's the enterprise application, which we just created. Now I'm actually going to click out of here, and I'm going to go back to the parent of our Entra ID, and I'm actually going to go over into app registrations. So if we go and we look at all of our app registrations, you're going to see that we now have an app registration. The reason that is sort of how this all works, is an app registration is essentially the core component of an enterprise application. I could have started it from here or started it from the enterprise application. I just chose to do it from there. But you can actually create them from either. So an app registration is really sort of the high-level object. And what this allows us to do, and there's a lot of different things it can do. So I'm just going into what it does specifically for us. We'll cover today is what does this app registration have access to do? So this, we're going to define all the various permissions that this has access to. So we're going to limit the scope of what this can do. Secondly, we then need to secure this application. So now we know what it can do, but how do we authenticate and how do we authorize to this service principal or app registration? Are we going to use a client secret? Are we going to use a certificate? And then there's the whole concept of federated credentials, which is outside the scope of this. We'll get into federated credentials once we start to talk about the out-of-box connections of ADO into other components of Azure, like Key Vault, Azure Automation. Azure is able to manage all the secrets for you, so you don't have to touch them at all. It's wonderful. But in this instance, we need a secret that we can put inside of Terraform so that it can be managed appropriately. So this is essentially how we authenticate and what the principal can do. But back to the enterprise application that we had created first, you'll see what that allows us to do is define who has access to that particular enterprise application. So if I go back here and I find Terraform Azure DevOps, What then now we can do is assign who has the ownership access to this enterprise app, who's able to use it and has access here. This is really helpful when it comes to the single sign-on capabilities. Kind of how the two work is an app registration really is the top level. And for every app registration, you will have one or more enterprise applications. My head actually goes the other way around. Like when I first saw this, I thought, an enterprise application. Oh, and then you have different registrations of that application. That's actually not the case. So the way I remember this is it's actually backwards than where my brain goes. But other people's brains must work differently, I guess. So an app registration is the top level, and then you can have different enterprise applications underneath those across different tenants. So if you have something, a multi-tenant solution, which we don't have here, you can create different ones. You can't have multiple enterprise applications to the same app registration in the same tenant. So there only has to be one per tenant. So because we're doing a single tenant solution, this is meant to be for an enterprise, we're only going to have one in this instance. So I have my app registration, so I'm going to go back to that and grab Terraform Azure DevOps. So what I need to do here first is, actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the certificate in here. That's what I'm going to do. We're going to talk about the permissions in a separate video. I think it's going to be better only because it's going to allow us to capture why we have those particular API permissions. So if I go to the client secret, this is how it's going to authenticate. All I have to do here is say, give me a client secret. So we have to give a description. So this is, we're just going to say Terraform ADO secret, recommended over 180 days and 6 months. Great. I'm going to add this. I'm going to copy our client secret. Again, this client secret is how we're going to authenticate into to use this service principal. So now if I go back into into Terraform, here's our prod secrets. I'm going to go to the ARM. Actually, I need to modify this. We're going to go to our ARM client secret, edit this variable, paste that guy in there, and save. Save this variable group, and that's how we authenticate it. Actually, let's cover how we do the actual API permissions. I think we have time. So this is how we do. Now, Terraform's able to authenticate to this, but now we just have the middle portion of this. Terraform still can't use the service principal in ADO. It doesn't have access. And the service principal doesn't have the permission it needs to anyway in those systems. So let's do the first portion, is let's get it access inside of Azure DevOps. What's beautiful about Azure DevOps, if I go into the org settings, move my head out of the way. If we go into the org settings, we're going to go into our users. And now we need to add a user so that it has access or it has a license to be able to use Azure DevOps. So I'm going to add a user, and I'm just going to, and now here's Terraform Azure DevOps. Here's the application that I just created, and now I can actually add this. I'll give it a basic license. I don't think it needs an email. And we'll hit add, wait till this runs, and now you'll see what's really nice is it gives it a separate icon. So I can tell very visually that this is an actual AAD or Entra ID application. So now it has a license, because everything needs to have a license and to have access to the system. And now because we're going to use Terraform to manage all of the core components of ADO, it needs to be a collection admin. If you want to try to lock this down, be my guest, but there is a lot that goes into creating various permissions, and many times you want ADO to manage a lot of those core organizational structures. So we protect this in another way versus trying to create all these groups, trying to manage which this service principal has access to and running into all these permission issues. We control how Terraform's able to use this and put all the checks and balances there versus the other way around. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into our permissions in Azure DevOps, go to my collection admins. Now I see who all of those people are, and I'm going to go into, I want Terraform Azure DevOps, now even has the logo there, and now that service principal now has full access, collection admin into Azure DevOps. Great, wonderful. So again, Terraform knows about it. Azure DevOps now knows that it can use that service principal. However, we need that third piece. And that third piece really is Now that service principal needs the ability to have the scopes we need to actually use it. So just because it has access doesn't mean it's been granted the permission to be able to do it. So if we come back here, this was the secret we used. And again, if we actually come back into the overview, and I'm just going to jump back into secrets, so you can see that this is here. And yep. Okay. And I just want to refresh this page. Come back into my secrets. Great, there we are. That's blanked out, tells me when it expires. Now I'm going to go into the API permissions. This now is going to dictate what it actually has access to. Just because it can authenticate does not mean it is authorized to do all the components that I need it to do. So what I'm going to do is add some very generic API permissions. So the first one that we're going to need is Azure DevOps, and we're going to need the user impersonation. So it needs to be able to impersonate a user so that it can access Azure DevOps. This is just a base permission. We absolutely need this one to be able to access Azure DevOps. Let's go back into another permission. The next one that we're going to need, and we're going to need a lot across this. As you can see, it's going to give us all sorts of permissions that we need. We need graph. Almost everything needs access to graph. We're going to need access to the users to be able to see a lot of the things in the directory. So what we're going to do now is we're going to grab some delegated permissions, and we're going to look for user read. We want to be able to read specifically information about this particular service principal. So what we'll say is user read, and this is a delegated permission. I mean, it's going to use the information about whatever is signed in. So it's just kind of like a basic permission we add to all of our service principals. Secondly, there's two additional permissions that we need as we go along farther as part of this entire setup. We're going to go back to graph, but these are going to be application permissions because this is going to be running in the background. So there's no user it's impersonating. This application is running itself. So if I grab this, there's two that we specifically need. We are going to need group.read.all, this one. Why do we need group read all? We need group read all because we need to be able to map Entra ID groups into ADO groups and GitHub teams. So we do all of the permissions and access through Entra ID. There's an Entra ID group for everything, and then we link that Entra ID group down into ADO groups, down into GitHub teams, and it's all managed within Entra. We don't manually add users into groups and try to manage it that way. It's a mess. And then if you have a user provisioning team or an automated provisioning process, again, all of that flows right through Entra, and then all of the pieces where it flows down from there into GitHub and ADO and even Terraform, it does it all for you. So in order for the service principal to see all those groups and do that linking, it's going to need group.read.all. The last one we're going to need, I'll jump back into the permissions for graph. This is another application permission, and we need application.read.all. So application read all. What this permission is going to allow us to do is when we create different service connections in Azure DevOps. So we're going to be creating a few of those as we go along here, most specifically to Azure Key Vault. We store all of our secrets for our deployments in Key Vault, and ADO has an out-of-box integration between ADO and Key Vault. The best way to do that is through a service connection. So we can get into service connections as we go along, but essentially what they are in the background is a service principal. There's a service principal that is allowing that connection between the two, and then that's where that federated credentials come in because it's Azure to Azure. So Microsoft just manages the connection for you. But in order for Terraform to create that object, manage that object, it has to be able to see all the applications, these enterprise applications, inside of your directory. So we're going to add that permission, and now that's set. So essentially what we've done here is we've now created a production service principal app registration that is secured by a client secret. And we assigned it various API permissions so that it's able to access the components of Entra ID that we need, and it has access into Azure DevOps. Then what we did is we assigned that service principal access into ADO. We gave it a license and we made it a collection admin. So now it has the authorization to do what it needs in Entra, and it has access into ADO to do what it needs. And lastly, now this ARM client secret, we've now pasted that secret inside of this variable group. And now Terraform is able to authenticate, and everything that Terraform does inside of ADO going forward will be under the context of this service principal. There's no users or anything like that. It's all within the context of this principal. So it's a wonderful setup. So what I won't show is we would essentially do this again. So we would essentially create, we have a Terraform Azure DevOps, is we'd create a Terraform Azure DevOps non-prod. And we'll talk about non-prod in our next video because we haven't created our non-prod. Unless you've been paying attention, and you'll see that down here we now have a Make Solutions Dev. So we're going to talk about that in our next video because now we need to start duplicating some of these efforts. We're not going to use the same service principal, we'll use a different one, but at the same time we can now be creating a DevOps prod and a DevOps non. If you are using Azure DevOps, you're using service principals to manage configurations in ADO, we'd love to hear how that works for you. If there's any challenges that you do or you run into, we'd love to hear about in your comments. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you in the next video.